Hello, dear friend. We're delighted to have you on the Historical Facts channel.
The 300, Between Myth and Memory. An Epic of History and Legend. Chapter 1. The Shadow on the Mountain. A mystery cloaked in bronze and blood. There is a pass in Greece, narrow as a whisper, where the mountains press so close to the sea that an army 10,000 strong must squeeze through in single file. They call it Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for the sulphurous springs that bubble from the earth as if the ground itself is breathing. It was here, in the autumn of 480 BC, that something happened which the world has never quite stopped arguing about. The story, as most of us know it, goes like this. 300 Spartan warriors, led by their king Leonidas, stood against the greatest army the ancient world had ever assembled. The Persians numbered in the millions, or so they said. For 3 days the Spartans held the pass. Then a traitor revealed a mountain path that flanked their position. Surrounded and abandoned, the 300 made their final stand and died to the last man, buying time for Greece to survive. Hollywood turned this into a thundering spectacle. But here is where the mystery begins. Almost nothing in that film happened the way the film shows it. And yet, the real history is, if anything, even more dramatic, even more strange, even more worthy of obsession. The truth of Thermopylae has been buried under centuries of mythology, nationalistic retelling, and outright fabrication. What remains beneath is extraordinary. So what really happened at the Hot Gates? The mystery is not whether the 300 were brave. They were. The mystery is who they truly were, and what we have done to their memory in the 2.5 millennia since they fell. Chapter 2. The World That Made the Spartans. Before the battle, there was the forge. To understand Thermopylae, you must first understand Sparta. And to understand Sparta, you must set aside almost everything you think you know about it. Sparta's power rested on a foundation modern historians find deeply troubling: the Helots. An enslaved population, likely the original inhabitants of the land conquered centuries before, who outnumbered their masters perhaps 7-1. Every autumn, the Spartans formally declared war on the Helots, allowing any Spartan to kill any Helot without legal consequence. The Crypteia, a secret police of young Spartan men, hunted and murdered Helots to keep the population in terror. This is the society that Hollywood romanticizes as a paradise of freedom. And yet the entire Spartan economy, the thing that allowed Spartan men to do nothing but train and fight, was built on the backs of hundreds of thousands of enslaved human beings. This is not a minor footnote. It is the central fact of Spartan life. The famous agoge, the military training system, was real, and it was brutal. Boys were taken from their mothers at age 7, given inadequate food, and taught to steal, the theory being that a soldier who can feed himself in enemy territory is more valuable than one who cannot. They slept on reeds they cut themselves from the riverbank. They wore a single garment year-round. They were regularly beaten, not as punishment, but as method. Historical fact. Spartan women had extraordinary freedoms for the ancient world. They owned property, exercised publicly, and could divorce their husbands. The film's Queen Gorgo is one of its more accurate touches, but her dramatic political speeches are invented for narrative purposes. Sparta was, in a word, alien. a city without walls, because, as Spartans said, their men were their walls. No great temples, no philosophy, no poetry of note. What it had was soldiers. And in 480 BC, those soldiers were about to face the greatest test their civilization had ever seen. Chapter 3. The God King Comes. Xerxes I, the man Hollywood turned into a monster. He arrived like a force of nature. Xerxes I, king of kings, son of Darius the Great, ruler of the largest empire in human history. Herodotus places his army at over 2 million. Modern historians estimate between 100,000 and 300,000, still an almost incomprehensible host for the ancient world. Xerxes was not a 7-foot-tall, hairless giant covered in piercings. He was, by all historical accounts, exceptionally tall, but he was a man, a capable administrator, a king of considerable personal courage, present at his battles, visible, invested, not seated on a golden throne at a safe distance, as the film portrays. Xerxes was no monster. He was something more disturbing to the Greek imagination, a man who believed he was above the gods, and who commanded an empire large enough to make that belief seem reasonable. Historical fact. The Persian immortals, the royal guard, 10,000 strong, earned their name because whenever one fell, another stepped up immediately, maintaining the number at exactly 10,000. They were professionals, not monsters, and they still could not break the Greek phalanx at Thermopylae. Hollywood fiction. The film's immortals wear terrifying black masks and move like supernatural beings. The real Persians wore elaborate scale armor and carried composite bows of devastating range. Formidable soldiers who, in the narrow pass, found their overwhelming numbers meant absolutely nothing. Chapter 4. Leonidas, the king who knew. He did not blunder into a trap. He walked into it with open eyes. Here is the most important thing the movie gets wrong about Leonidas. It is not about his abs, or his armor, or his famous one-liners. It is about his knowledge. The historical Leonidas knew exactly what he was doing. He was approximately 60 years old. The oracle at Delphi had delivered a prophecy. Sparta would either lose a king or lose the city. Leonidas, scholars believe, chose to fulfill that prophecy himself rather than leave it to chance. This changes everything. Leonidas did not lead 300 men to their deaths because he believed they would win. He led them there because he believed their deaths would serve a purpose, military, political, and symbolic, that their survival would not. The sacrifice was, in the most precise and chilling sense, deliberate. Historical fact. Leonidas selected his 300 personally and chose only men who had already fathered sons. He was not choosing his best fighters. He was choosing men who had already secured Sparta's future, men who could be spared without ending their family line. This was not heroic recklessness. It was cold, careful planning. Hollywood fiction. The film presents the 300 as Sparta's finest, chosen for ferocity. The deeper, stranger truth that they were chosen precisely because they were already fathers, already expendable in the most clinical sense, is never mentioned. It would complicate the clean, heroic narrative. Molon labe, come and take them. Whether Leonidas actually said these words, history cannot confirm, but they are so perfectly Spartan in their brevity and defiance that it almost doesn't matter. The total Greek force at Thermopylae was somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men, not 300. The Thespians, the Arcadians, the Corinthians, they were there too. But it is Sparta's name that history remembered. Chapter 5. The 3 Days of Fire. What actually happened in the pass? The battle lasted 3 days, that much is agreed. Everything else exists in a haze of ancient testimony, nationalistic legend, and the natural tendency of survivors to reshape memory into myth. On the first day, Xerxes reportedly waited 4 hours before ordering an attack, unable to believe that the small Greek force intended to hold the pass. When his infantry finally advanced, they met something they had never encountered: the Greek phalanx. A wall of overlapping shields, 8 men deep, bristling with spears extending 9 feet beyond the front rank, almost impenetrable in a narrow space. The Persians sent in their best troops. The phalanx shredded them. Historical fact: the Spartans' key tactical advantage was the feigned retreat. The phalanx would break apart as if fleeing, drawing pursuing Persians out of formation, then wheel and cut them to pieces. This required extraordinary discipline. It was not raw savagery that made the Spartans deadly. It was choreographed, rehearsed, almost mechanical precision. Hollywood fiction. The film shows individual Spartans performing superhuman acrobatic feats. The actual lethality of the Spartan method came from the group, not the individual. A Spartan who broke from the phalanx to fight solo was a liability, not an asset. On the second day, Xerxes tried again. Again, the Greeks held. Herodotus tells us Xerxes leapt from his throne 3 times in agitation, watching his army fail. Then came the night of the second day, and with it, Ephialtes of malice. He was a local Greek who knew the mountains. He knew the Anopaia path, a goat trail that wound around the mountain and came out behind the Greek position. He went to Xerxes and offered to show it. His name became, in Greek, a synonym for traitor, as recognizable as Judas would become in Christian tradition. By morning, the immortals had flanked the Greek position. The trap was complete. Chapter 6. The Night Before the Last Stand. What Leonidas knew and what he chose. Imagine the scene: a mountain pass at night, campfires burning low, the smell of blood and sulfur in the air, men cleaning weapons they know they will use for the last time, and a king, perhaps 60 years old, walking among them in the darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that by sunset tomorrow most of the men he can see will be dead. The Thespians who stayed, approximately 700 of them, did not stay because Leonidas asked them to. They stayed because they had no real choice. Thespia, their city, lay directly in the path of the Persian advance. They knew that surrender meant the destruction of everything they loved. The Thespians died in greater numbers than the Spartans, and history has given them almost none of the credit. The Greeks had a word, kalos thanatos, the beautiful death. To die in battle, at the height of one's powers, in defense of one's people. The Spartans had spent their entire lives training for this moment. When it came, they did not flinch. On the morning of the third day, the Greeks advanced into wider ground beyond the pass, where Persian numbers could finally tell, and fought until every last one was dead. Leonidas fell early. The Persians were under orders to capture him alive, a mark of how deeply Xerxes feared and respected the Spartan king. The Greeks fought over his body with such ferocity that they drove the Persians back 4 times before being overwhelmed. In the end, the surviving Greeks retreated to a small hill. The Persians buried them under a hail of arrows. The pass was open. The road to Athens lay ahead. And for a moment, it must have seemed to Xerxes that he had won everything. Chapter 7. After the Gates. The battle was lost. The war was won. Thermopylae was a military defeat. Let us be absolutely clear about this. The Persians won. They killed the Greek defenders, desecrated the body of Leonidas, and marched into Greece. Athens was evacuated and burned. The Acropolis was sacked. Xerxes had his revenge. And then, almost immediately, everything went wrong for Persia. At the naval battle of Salamis, barely weeks after Thermopylae, Themistocles lured the vast Persian fleet into the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland. In the confined waters, Persian numerical advantage became a liability. The fleet became entangled in itself. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore as his fleet was destroyed. The evacuation of Athens, made possible by the time that Thermopylae bought, was the decision that made Salamis possible. The following year, at Plataea, the full Spartan army destroyed what remained of the Persian land force. The invasion was over. Greece had survived. And the sacrifice of those 3 days in a mountain pass had made the difference. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. 20 words that contain an entire civilization's understanding of duty, death, and dignity. Chapter 8. How the Legend Was Built. 2,500 years of myth-making. Herodotus wrote his Histories, our primary source for Thermopylae, roughly 40 years after the events. He was the world's first great historian, and also, unabashedly, a storyteller. His account is magnificent and probably part fiction. The speeches are invented, the numbers are exaggerated. The famous anecdote, the Spartan told that Persian arrows would blot out the sun, who replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade," may or may not have happened. But Herodotus was doing something more important than transcribing events. He was constructing meaning. Through the centuries, Thermopylae was invoked again and again as a model of heroic resistance. Each era reshaped the story to fit its own anxieties. The 19th century was particularly enthusiastic. The British public school system explicitly modeled itself on the agoge. Boys were taught to be Spartan, to endure, to obey, to die without complaint. It is no coincidence that the most Spartan thing about the British Empire at its height was its relationship to death. Hollywood fiction. The film 300 is based not on Herodotus, but on Frank Miller's 1998 graphic novel, which was itself based on a 1962 film, which was based on a 1950s popular history. The Hollywood version is thus 4 layers removed from primary sources, a copy of a copy of a copy of a myth that was already mythologized by its first teller. Chapter 9. The Uncomfortable Truths. What we lose by making Sparta into a fantasy. There is a cost to the Hollywood version of Thermopylae, and it is not merely historical accuracy. When we strip away the Helots, erase the Thespians, and turn the Persians into faceless evil, we do something worse than getting the facts wrong. We lose the ability to ask the right questions. When Leonidas marched to Thermopylae, he took with him not just 300 Spartan warriors, but several hundred Helot servants, whose job was to carry supplies and do the work that Spartan warriors considered beneath them. These men are entirely absent from the film, and yet without them, the battle as it actually happened could not have occurred. And what of Xerxes? The man Hollywood made into a god monster was one of the most capable administrators the ancient world produced. The Persian Empire had a postal system, standardized currency, and roads not equaled in the West for centuries. Persian policy generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own religions. Calling Persia a force of tyranny and darkness requires ignoring almost everything we know about how the Persian Empire actually functioned. Hollywood fiction. The film has been criticized by scholars not just for historical inaccuracies, but for its political implications. A small, pure Western force fighting a vast, corrupt, exotic Eastern empire maps uncomfortably onto modern geopolitical anxieties. The director denied any political intention. The critics were not persuaded. None of this means the Spartans were wrong to resist. Resistance to conquest is not diminished by the moral complexity of the resistors. But the story is richer, stranger, and more instructive than the simple tale of freedom versus tyranny that Hollywood tells. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Myth. What Thermopylae actually means and why it refuses to die. We have traveled a long road from that narrow pass. We have met the real Leonidas, not the shouting action hero, but the old king who chose his death with the precision of a surgeon. We have met the real Persians, not monsters, but men, dying in thousands against a wall of shields they could not break. We have met the Thespians, who fought and died and are almost forgotten. We have met the Helots, who made the whole thing possible and are never mentioned. And now, at the end, we must ask, what remains? What is the truth in the myth? The courage was real. The men who stood in that pass and held it for 3 days, knowing they would not survive, displayed something genuine. Whatever we think of Sparta's social system, the courage was real. The sacrifice was real. The time that Thermopylae bought was not mythological. The evacuation of Athens, the Battle of Salamis, the survival of Greek civilization. These things happened because the army of Xerxes spent 3 days bottled up in a mountain pass, losing men it could not afford to lose. The story's power is real. There is something in the image of a small force holding a narrow place against overwhelming odds, choosing death over surrender, that speaks to something deep in the human spirit. It speaks to every person who has ever stood between something they love and the thing that threatens it. That resonance is not manufactured, it is earned. The Hollywood version is a lie, but it is a lie that points, however clumsily, toward a truth. The truth is not that 300 perfect warriors held back 1,000,000 monsters through sheer physical magnificence. The truth is that a society built on slavery and violence produced, at a particular moment, something that transcended both. A decision to stand, knowing the cost, and to pay it without flinching. The hot gates have been silent for 25 centuries. You can stand there now and see almost nothing of what Leonidas saw. But the stone is still there, and somewhere under the soil, so are the bones. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The law they obeyed was something older than Sparta, written in the bone of every human being who has ever stood between the world they love and the darkness that threatens it. Thermopylae is that moment. Not as Frank Miller drew it, not as Zack Snyder filmed it, but as it actually was. A small army at a narrow pass, 3 days of blood and bronze and terrible human will, and a king who walked into the dark with his eyes open and his shield on his arm.
That is enough. That has always been enough. Thank you for staying with us. A new video is released every week. Subscribe to the Historical Facts channel so you don't miss it, where you'll find plenty more fascinating stories about our world. All the best, and see you next time.